Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video we're going to start with the power steering pump. So first we're going to pull the reservoir out. So we're going to pull it straight up and it moves out of the way, just like that. And with that out of the way, you can access this lower nut on the power steering pump. There's a bolt coming through, but on this side, right below the pulley, you can see a nut threaded out. So you can get it in a couple of ways. One is to put a wrench and sneak the wrench in between the belt right there, and you can loosen the nut that way, or you can use a socket from in front as well. If it starts to turn, you'll want to hold the bolt. So right past the exhaust manifold, right in there is that bolt, and you'll need an extension to get in there like this and hold that bolt from turning while you loosen the nut. If it starts turning on you. So if you're just changing the belt, you can just loosen that nut. You don't need to remove that nut and bolt completely. And then you can also go and loosen the tensioner and take the belt off. But we are going to be completely removing this for this teardown, so you can take the nut and completely remove it. Okay, now we're going to loosen this wing nut. So if it's really tight, you can use a pair of pliers to break it loose at first, and then just spin it loose by hand. You just want to keep spinning it and then push down on the power steering pump until it is loose enough to remove the belt. So if you just want to change the belt again, keep loosening that, push down, and then you'll get to a point where you can slide the belt over the pulley. We're going to remove it completely, so we're going to be also taking out another nut and a bolt, which we'll show in a minute here. Okay, then we're going to remove the nut as well for that tensioner right there. So you can break that one loose and spin it off. And then we're also going to remove this 10mm head here, this bolt as well for the that plate that's holding the tensioner on. And then you can wiggle the whole assembly out. If it's hard to get it out, you might need to push that lower bolt in a little bit so that you can remove the entire power steering. So now we've got it out. We're going to leave all the hoses connected. You don't need to disconnect any of your hoses. It's an important thing. But once it's loose, then you can just pick it up, lift it, and set it aside. I'm going to thread my bolts back in where they go so I know later. No confusion. Put it back in and thread the nut on so it doesn't slide out. Then the same thing with the tensioner bolt as well. And then we don't even have to put them in a container. We can just leave them on the pump, and it's ready to be reinstalled later on. Okay, now we're going to move to the alternator. First we're going to loosen the top bolt. So I'm using my 3/8 wrench here. It's nice if you have a long one, because some of these bolts are in there tight. This one is beautiful. It's extendable. I love it, and the head is also flexible, so you can find one like this or just find a long one. Will make it easier. So take that top bolt out first. Then we're going to also disconnect the electrical connector. There's a green connector to the right side of the video. Push the tab in and pull, and that will come out. That's the control circuit for the alternator, so the computer will vary the inner parts of the alternator to charge or lessen how much charge it's putting into the battery. Okay, now we have the main cable here should be a 10mm. You can loosen this one. It's underneath the rubber. Just pull back the rubber and you can get that nut off, and then that eyelet that's going over that stud can be removed. Okay, then use a screwdriver and push down on this plastic tab and pull straight away from it, and it will release all the electrical connectors here where they're attached. Then you can move that harness out of the way. Now we're going to go underneath the car. This is the tensioner for the alternator belt. So another wing nut and another bolt there, which you tighten and loosen to vary how tight the belt is. So first we're going to loosen this lower bolt. Okay, then we're going to loosen this wing nut, and when you loosen the wing nut, it will allow you to move the alternator in a bit and lessen the tension on the belt. So every time you do that and pull on the belt like that, you'll see it brings the alternator in and gets it to the point where you can take that belt off and remove it. So we're going to remove the alternator completely, so we're also going to remove this bolt that is in that sliding tensioner right here. So we're going to take that one out all the way. Okay, the top one I just left it in for now, just so it can pivot. So now I'm going to remove it the rest of the way. So this bolt can't be completely removed the way it hits the frame here. But if you think you need a little more length to get the bolt out, like just get it back enough so the alternator comes out, then also remove the bracket for the power steering. It's just one bolt, and you can move that out of the way, and it'll allow you to move the bolt right into the frame. So once you've got that bolt back as far as you can, then you know that you'll be able to move the alternator back. So I'm just using a pry bar. You should put a hand there. I just dropped mine down under the car, but use a pry bar and wiggle that back and try and catch it as it releases. It's a little tight in that space. So in the next clips here, I'm going to be removing the intake manifold. Now this step, most of you will actually be able to skip. You can leave the intake manifold attached to the cylinder head and just remove some bolts at the bottom on some brackets, which I'll show you later, and then leave the intake on when you remove the head. So then once it's off the car, you can remove the intake manifold, and it'll be a lot easier, but I wanted to make a video showing how to do it. So you can skip ahead if you don't want to watch it, but here we go. I'm going to remove the throttle. You don't have to do this step either, but I just want to show how you do that. So the evap solenoid has some hoses here, a little clamp. You can wiggle it back, pull the hose off, and that will allow you to move the entire throttle out of the way. There's also some other hoses on it, so if you want to take it right out, you just disconnect all the lines on it, and you can remove it from the car. So there's 4 bolts, 3 bolts and 1 nut actually. So just remove those. They stay inside the throttle. They won't come out all the way, but you can loosen them. Okay, then just grab the throttle and wiggle it up, and it'll slide right up. Underneath it, there is a gasket. It's this blue gasket that you see there. It's good to change that gasket whenever you remove the throttle, just so you don't get any leaks. If you do have some running problems, it could be that gasket. Okay, now we're going to remove this whole wiring harness for the ignition coils. So there's some bolts and some nuts holding it in. Remove the brackets that were holding the throttle cable, as you saw before, and just all the bolts there. There's another one that holds the throttle cable. So just try and label it and know which one goes where. Will make it easier when putting it back together later. Okay, once you've removed all those, you can lift it up and out of the way and unplug the fuel injector connectors. So there's 4 of them, and this is what they look like off the car. They're the circled in red things. So that's where they're located, and you just grab on the side of each and you pull up and you can unplug them. Removing another bracket here. Okay, now we're going to remove this evap port. There's just a little tab there, and you just push it in and it slides up and out of the holder. This just gives you room to remove this top nut. It's this big long nut, and that's what's holding in the intake manifold. There's two like that, and then there's also a bolt down at the bottom there. That one needs to come out. And exactly like that, but on the other side you have the same thing. Another nut there, and then another bolt down at the bottom below that. Right there. Okay, now this one is the worst one to get at. You have to get it from underneath, or you could probably reach around, but it's directly above the oil filter right there. So here's a shot of it out of the car. It's this bolt right here in the center. So it's a little tough to get at, but you can do it. You just kind of have to turn it little by little and work it out. So now, starting at the top again, we're going to remove this hose for the idle air control valve, and it's just kind of blocking us from getting that first nut out. So just remove the clamp, and then I'm using a pick to kind of break that seal loose, and then you can pull that hose off. I'm using a U-joint socket here, 12mm socket. Just kind of helps getting in tighter angles, but you could probably do it just by hand as well. So there's the nut. It's a long nut. And then there's the bolt below it. This one I'm using a ratcheting gear wrench. And this one was in there really tight. So here's a trick you can do. You use one wrench, and the open side you can hook in the box end of another wrench. And that will give you basically double the torque. You lock it in like that, and then you can use it to get that mechanical advantage to break it loose. Once you've broken it loose, then you can just remove it the rest of the way. Okay, then that nut again on the other side, on the driver's side of the car. Same thing. Break that one loose, remove it, and then the bolt below that as well. Okay, back under the car. This is on the passenger side, right next to the right of the oil filter and the block heater there. There's 4 bolts holding this bracket in. You only have to remove the 2 on the left, which look left in the video, but they're actually the 2 bottom ones. And those 2 will allow you to be able to lift it out. You can leave the 2 on the top connected. I found just taking the top 2 out on those brackets doesn't allow you to slide the intake manifold back enough to get it out from the studs. So you'll want to take out those bottom ones. Okay, and now to the left of the oil filter, there's 1 bolt for the left bracket that you also need to remove, and it's that one right there. So once you've got all these nuts and bolts removed that you see in this diagram, and the brackets down there, then you should be able to remove the intake manifold with the fuel injectors attached to it. That'll be the easiest way to get it out. So you'll have the fuel lines disconnected and the wiring of the injectors, and then you can wiggle the entire thing back. You'll see here that mine came out in 2 pieces because I did it the hard way basically, but just save yourself a headache and take it out like that, and then when it's on the bench, you can separate the fuel injectors from the intake manifold. Just want to highlight this hose for you guys quick. It's kind of a little bit hidden underneath, and it goes right there on the intake manifold. So you also have to remove that one. It just has a spring clamp and then pulls off. And then the whole intake manifold should be able to come out easily after that. Now I'm removing the fuel rail manifold and gasket. Just slides right off. Yours should probably come out with the intake like we were saying before. Okay, now we're going to do the exhaust manifold. We're going to remove it. So first step, we're going to unplug the O2 sensor. So the top O2 sensor right here just has a connector that you push the tab in and pull straight back, and it will unplug. And you want to label these and make sure you don't get them mixed up, because these can go in the opposite connector. Okay, now we're going to remove the exhaust manifold. So some of the bolts are actually a 12-point socket. They're a 12-point head, so you need a 12-point socket to remove them. And some will just be normal. So this is a 10mm socket that's a 12-point. Typically, you want to use 6-point sockets because 12 points can strip easily, so I don't usually like to use them. But this socket, or this bolt here, is actually made for a 12-point socket. So starting with the top, we're going to remove these two bolts for this heat shield. I take out the entire exhaust manifold in this video, but for most of you, you won't need to do that. You just need to loosen the manifold bolts and then the one bracket bolt down below, and that will allow you to pull it back enough to get the head out. We're going to remove the top bolt there. You can leave the other ones intact for the heat shield. That's for the lower heat shield, but we just want to remove the upper heat shield. I'm going to go over to the other side and remove the same bolt on that side as well. Then the wiring for O2 sensor number 2, we're going to pop it out of these holding tabs. So one there and then one on the other side. And as you see, it just kind of pushes out and it'll pop out when you push down to the open side of the holding tab there. Then the same kind of connector as the first one, just squeeze the tab and pull it back and you can remove it. Okay, we're going to go under the car now. There's two bolts with these funny little springs in them, and they're what's holding this exhaust flange together. So this is the bottom of the catalytic converter and the pipe that goes out to the back of the car. So we're just going to break these loose, kind of go back and forth one to another, and then once they're a little bit loose, you can just remove them all the way. But be careful, because with these springs in there, they will kind of shoot out a little bit when you get it to the very end of the thread. Okay, and there's one bracket for this catalytic converter, and if you look down through this hole, it's that bolt right there. So with about a 4-inch extension and a deep socket, seemed like the right length from up top to get it. So it's right there, that's where it's located. I'll show you it again when it's off the car. Okay, bottom's loose, brackets are all loose. So now we're going to go back up top and remove the rest of the bolts up here. So some are 12 mil heads, and then there's some that are the 12 points like we talked about earlier. Remove them all. There's also one stud on this one with a nut, but the nut was missing. So you may or may not have one in yours. It looked like there was a couple bolts missing, so whoever put it together last kind of did the 1-2 skip a few trick. So This is always a nice surprise when you remove a bolt and you find that the thread has come out with the bolt. Nothing you can really do about that when that happens. So we'll repair this thread. We'll show you how to drill it out and put in an insert later. Here's the stud that I was talking about. That one should have a nut on it as well. So once you've removed all of those, then you can grab the exhaust and just wiggle it back and remove it from the vehicle. Here's that bracket underneath that I was talking about, that last one that's holding it in. Okay guys, that does it for this video. I'll see you in the next videos where we will continue.